Charlotte, at just 21 years old, was an ambitious young woman who worked tirelessly as Theodore's personal assistant, a renowned 65-year-old businessman. Her days were long and filled with demanding tasks, yet her determination never wavered. She didn't just perform her duties, she executed them with precision and efficiency that set her apart. From a young age, Charlotte knew life wouldn't be easy. She grew up in financially challenging circumstances where every penny counted, and each meal was a victory. Her father worked a grueling, poorly paid job, while her mother took on odd jobs to make ends meet. Charlotte witnessed firsthand the sacrifices her parents made to provide the bare necessities. She vowed to herself she would escape this life and achieve a reality filled with luxury and comfort. Early in her career, Charlotte quickly stood out. Her sharp intellect and ability to anticipate Theodore's needs earned his trust above all others. Yet, this trust wasn't enough for Charlotte. She yearned for more, something only a life of wealth could offer. Every night, returning to her small apartment, Charlotte gazed at the city lights and dreamed. She dreamed of mansions, luxury cars, and glamorous parties. But these dreams came with deep sadness and emotional emptiness. She knew that to achieve her goals, she would have to sacrifice parts of herself that she might never regain. After a long day's work, Charlotte returned home, her shoulders heavy with responsibility. In her modest apartment, she allowed herself a moment of weakness. The thin walls failed to muffle the city's sounds, and the cold moonlight poured through curtain-less windows. Sitting on the edge of her bed, Charlotte's eyes fixed on the distant city lights. Silent tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, "I will get out of here. I will make it." She closed her eyes, recalling her childhood, the simple, worn-out house, her parents' weary faces, the days when food was scarce. Memories of cold nights when her parents layered more blankets on her and went without so she wouldn't feel cold. These moments served as a constant reminder of what she refused to accept for herself. Charlotte took a deep breath, wiped away her tears, and stood up. She looked at herself in the mirror, eyes red and swollen, yet filled with determination. "I won't fail," she declared, her voice steady and resolute. She understood that every sacrifice, every tear shed, was a step toward her goal. Despite the pain, she was willing to face anything to achieve her dreams. The next day, Charlotte woke early, ready to face another day. She put on her best smile and headed to work, determined to maintain her flawless facade. In the office, she was impeccable, anticipating Theodore's every need, attending to every detail with military precision. But behind that confident smile was a young woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, fighting daily not to be consumed by her ambitions and constant fear of failure. Each interaction with Theodore was a mix of emotions. He was a seasoned, sharp man who always seemed one step ahead. Charlotte felt a blend of admiration and fear, knowing she needed to be flawless to continue earning his trust. Day by day, she meticulously built the bridge she believed would lead her to the life she had always dreamed of, unaware that each step on this path took her further away from herself. Charlotte was willing to do whatever it took to achieve her goals. She knew the road would be long and full of obstacles, but her determination was unshakable. She would fight, she would suffer, and she would sacrifice whatever was necessary to ensure her future was different from her past. And as the city lights shimmered outside, she promised herself once more that she would not fail. Charlotte noticed a strange behavior in Theodore one ordinary afternoon at work. He was more reserved, more contemplative than usual. Business meetings were punctuated by long moments of silence, and his eyes seemed to lose their usual sparkle. Charlotte, always vigilant, sensed that something was amiss. She observed Theodore more closely, trying to decipher what was going on. During one of these silent moments, Theodore withdrew to his private office, closing the door behind him. Fueled by growing curiosity, Charlotte stealthily approached the slightly ajar door. She listened to low murmurs and then the sound of a persistent cough that seemed to shake Theodore's body. The sound cut through the house's silence like an alarm bell. Her heart raced. A wave of anxiety and concern washed over her. Charlotte decided to wait until the end of the day to investigate further. When everyone had left and the house was enveloped in an almost palpable quiet, she entered Theodore's office. Discreetly rummaging through his belongings, she found an envelope from a renowned hospital. Inside were medical test results and a devastating diagnosis. Theodore had a terminal illness, with only a few months left to live. Shock overtook Charlotte. She felt a mixture of compassion and despair. Compassion for seeing Theodore as a vulnerable man, very different from the powerful businessman she knew. Yet soon this compassion was overshadowed by a cold, calculated thought. Her opportunity had finally arrived. The following days were an emotional torment. Charlotte meticulously studied Theodore's financial documents and the details of his will. She discovered he had a vast fortune, but also that he was a meticulous man who safeguarded his interests well. Her nights were sleepless, torn between guilt and ambition. She felt like a predator lying in wait, her conscience battling against her desire for a better life. Each encounter with Theodore now carried a new intensity. She saw him as a man teetering on the edge, and it tormented her. In an intimate dinner she organized at her home, Charlotte carefully prepared everything, choosing Theodore's favorite dishes and lighting candles to create a warm atmosphere. But during dinner, the food seemed to lose its taste, and the light conversation failed to mask the gravity of what she knew. As Theodore spoke about his company and the achievements he wanted to leave as his legacy, Charlotte watched him with painful attention. His eyes, normally full of life, now held a shadow of sadness she had never noticed before. He seemed fragile, almost too human, and this eroded the emotional armor Charlotte had built over the years. After dinner, as they sat on the couch, Theodore began talking about his past, his accomplishments, and his regrets. His voice was low and trembling. Charlotte felt a lump in her throat as she listened, torn between compassion and her plan. When Theodore casually mentioned needing to update his will, Charlotte felt a chill. This was her chance, the window of opportunity she had been waiting for. But Theodore's vulnerability momentarily disarmed her. She approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, trying to convey a reassurance she didn't feel herself. "Theodore," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "you know you can always count on me, don't you?" Theodore looked at her with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "I know, Charlotte. You've been a true friend. More than I could ask for." His words felt like knives in her heart, cutting through her cold, calculated determination. She knew her path was fraught with thorns and that the suffering she felt now was just the beginning. But she couldn't retreat. Her desire for a better life was stronger than her guilt, and as Theodore looked at her with eyes full of trust and vulnerability, she decided she would do anything to secure her future. Charlotte lay down that night with tears in her eyes, the pain of her decision weighing heavily on her chest. She was determined to press forward, but with each step, her soul seemed to grow heavier, the shadow of guilt and despair growing ever larger. Charlotte woke up the next morning with an overwhelming heaviness in her chest. The memory of Theodore's confident gaze from the previous night haunted her. Every word he had spoken echoed in her mind, mingling with her own doubts and fears. She knew she needed to maintain her facade, but the internal battle between her ambition and morality was beginning to corrode her. At the office, she carried out her tasks with the usual precision, but her thoughts were distant. While Theodore was in a meeting, she seized the opportunity to delve deeper into his will. She knew she needed a meticulous plan to gain his complete trust and perhaps, in some way, influence his decisions. Every move had to be calculated, every word had to be perfect. During a sunny afternoon, Theodore suggested a walk in the park. He was more fragile than ever, and every step seemed to require effort. Charlotte offered her arm to support him, and they walked together in silence. The gentle breeze contrasted with the turmoil within Charlotte. She observed Theodore with a gaze that mixed pity with determination. Her plan needed to be set in motion now. Sitting on a bench, Theodore began talking about his legacy. "Charlotte, you know I don't have much time," he began, his voice laden with melancholy. "I need to get everything in order. My children, they're not as interested in the business as I had hoped." He paused, gazing at the horizon, lost in his thoughts. Charlotte felt her heart tighten, but she forced a reassuring smile. "Theodore, you've done so much. Built an empire. And there are people who care about you," she said, her voice tinged with calculated sweetness. He smiled faintly, and for a moment, Charlotte saw the young visionary he must have once been. "Sometimes I feel that when I'm gone, everything I've built will crumble," he confessed. Charlotte seized the opportunity, gently holding his hand. "That won't happen. I'll be here to help to ensure your legacy continues," she said, her words gentle yet firm. Theodore squeezed her hand, silent gratitude in his eyes. Days passed, and Charlotte intensified her efforts. She arranged special dinners, found ways to spend more time with Theodore, listening to his stories, laughing at his jokes, and caring for him with almost obsessive dedication. Every forced smile, every word of affection she uttered, stabbed at her own soul. Guilt began to weigh more heavily, but she knew she couldn't stop now. On a particularly cold night, Charlotte offered to prepare tea for Theodore. In the kitchen, she allowed herself a moment to take a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Upon returning with the tray, she found Theodore looking at old photos. He seemed lost in memories, and Charlotte sat beside him, silently observing. "These were the days," Theodore murmured, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "So much has changed, and now here I am counting my last days." Charlotte felt a pang of deep pain. Theodore's vulnerability struck her hard, but she maintained her gentle and understanding expression. "Theodore, you still have time to do so many things," she tried to comfort him. "And I'll be here by your side." He looked at her with a gaze so full of trust and admiration that it almost disarmed her. "I know," he simply replied, squeezing her hand. "I know you will." That night, lying in her bed, Charlotte couldn't sleep. Theodore's words echoed in her mind, mixed with her own silent despair. She knew she was walking a fine line between her desire and emotional destruction. But what she hadn't expected was to feel so much, so deeply. Every gesture of affection she offered, every promise of support, was a blow to her own heart. With each passing day, Charlotte's plan moved forward, but the weight on her soul grew heavier. She was caught in a cycle of self-imposed suffering, where every step toward her goal pushed her further from peace. Theodore, unaware of Charlotte's internal battle, continued to trust her, seeing her as a safe harbor in his final days. And Charlotte, torn between ambition and guilt, pressed on, knowing that the path she had chosen was one of increasing pain and sacrifice. One night, while Theodore rests in his favorite chair, Charlotte prepares a glass of wine. She approaches him with a delicate smile and offers him the drink. Theodore accepts with a silent thank you, his eyes fixed on the fireplace. The crackling of the flames fills the silence between them, creating an atmosphere both cozy and laden with melancholy. "Theodore," Charlotte begins softly, "have you thought about how you'd like to spend your last months?" The question hangs in the air, heavy with implications. Theodore sighs, looking at the wine in his glass before responding. "I want to ensure everything is in order. My family, my businesses. You know how important it is to me," he says, his voice trembling with the weight of his concerns. Charlotte feels a pang of pain hearing his words, but she maintains her reassuring smile. "I know, and I'm here to help to ensure everything is as you wish," she replies, her voice a whisper of solace. Theodore looks at her with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she can't quite identify. Days turn into weeks, and the closeness between Charlotte and Theodore grows. In one intimate moment, as they walk through the moonlit garden, Theodore suddenly stops and takes her hand. "Charlotte, I have something important to tell you." Her heart races. This is the moment she both anticipated and feared. She looks at him, trying to hide the anxiety in her eyes. "What is it, Theodore?" He takes a deep breath before speaking. "I know about your intentions, Charlotte. I've always known. But still, I admire your determination and courage. That's why I want to ask you. Will you marry me?" Theodore's words are like an electric shock. Charlotte feels a wave of conflicting emotions. Relief at seeing her plan work, overwhelming guilt for her true intentions, and an unexpected sadness upon realizing the trust and affection he feels for her. She forces a smile, trying to hold back the tears threatening to fall. "Theodore, Yes, of course." Theodore's smile is filled with fragile happiness. They embrace, and Charlotte feels the weight of the world on her shoulders increase. From that moment on, their lives spiral into wedding preparations. Charlotte is actively involved, organizing every detail with almost obsessive perfection. She sees the sparkle in Theodore's eyes as he talks about their future plans, and each word is like a cutting blade to her soul. On the wedding day, Charlotte is stunning in her white dress, but inside she is shattered. As she walks down the aisle, her mind is a whirlwind of emotions. The vows she makes before Theodore are spoken with a lump in her throat. At the end of the ceremony, while everyone applauds and celebrates, she feels more alone than ever. In the weeks that follow, Charlotte tries to adapt to married life, but the sense of emptiness only grows. Theodore, increasingly frail, continues to trust her blindly. One night, as she helps him to bed, he holds her hand with surprising strength. "Charlotte, I promise to take care of you even after I'm gone," he says, his eyes full of a tenderness that makes her want to cry. She swallows hard, forcing a smile. "Thank you, Theodore. I know you will." But inside she is falling apart. Every gesture of affection, every word of trust from Theodore plunges her deeper into guilt and despair. Until one day, she finds the testament documents on the table. With trembling hands, she opens them, and her heart nearly stops to see that her name isn't there. All the sacrifice, all the emotional pain she endured, seems to have been in vain. Frustration consumes her, and she feels anger bubbling inside. She struggles to keep calm as Theodore enters the room, smiling at her with the same naive confidence. Charlotte retreats to the garden, where tears finally begin to fall. She feels betrayed, lost, crushed under the weight of her own choices. The sky darkens as she sinks onto the grass, her body trembling with silent sobs. The pain in her soul is profound, and she wonders how she reached this point, so far from everything she once dreamed of. The night descends slowly, wrapped in a silent darkness, as Charlotte remains lost in her thoughts in the garden. The stars seem as distant as the dreams she once held. Her tears dry, but the pain in her chest lingers, a constant reminder of her own weakness and impending failure. In the days that follow, Charlotte forces herself to carry on. She tends to Theodore with a dedication that is both sincere and tormenting. Every smile she offers, every gesture of affection she gives, serves as a reminder of the emotional debt she is accumulating. Theodore, increasingly debilitated, remains unaware of the storm raging inside her. One night, while helping Theodore to bed, Charlotte feels the urgency to confront him about the will. Frustration bubbles in her throat, but she suppresses it, forcing herself to remain calm. "Theodore, have you considered adjusting your will?" she asks, trying to sound casual, but her heart pounds against her chest. He looks at her with a tired yet serene expression. "Charlotte, my love, everything is already arranged. I trust my children will know what to do," he says with a confidence that disarms her. The lump in Charlotte's throat tightens, leaving her speechless, only nodding in agreement. After settling Theodore into bed, Charlotte retreats to the living room, where shadows dance on the walls, reflecting her internal turmoil. She sinks into the sofa, feeling utterly helpless. Her thoughts are a tangled mess of hopelessness and anger. How could she have deceived herself so? How could she have believed her actions would result in anything but pain? As she battles her own demons, the living room door opens gently, and Lucas, Theodore's eldest son, enters. He has been observing Charlotte from afar, suspicious of her sudden closeness to his father. "Can I talk to you?" he asks, his voice laden with distrust. Charlotte tries to compose herself, but surprise and fear are evident in her eyes. "Of course, Lucas. What do you need?" She forces a smile, but she feels he sees through her facade. Lucas sits across from her, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know what you're doing. You think you can fool everyone, but I know you're only after the inheritance," he says, his voice firm and full of disdain. Charlotte feels like the ground is crumbling beneath her feet. Fear mixes with anger, but she knows she must keep control. "Lucas, I don't know what you're talking about," she replies, trying to sound convincing, but her voice trembles slightly. "I love your father. I only want what's best for him." He shakes his head, a bitter smile spreading on his lips. "There's no use lying to me. I'm going to tell him everything. I'll expose you." Panic grips Charlotte. She stands up, trying to think quickly of a way to navigate the situation. "Please, Lucas, don't do this. Think of your father. It would destroy him," she pleads, her voice filled with desperation. But Lucas just looks at her with cold determination. Charlotte realizes she needs to change tactics. "Lucas, maybe we can resolve this another way. Perhaps we can meet, discuss this privately," she suggests, choosing her words carefully. The implication doesn't escape Lucas, who narrows his eyes, considering the proposal. He leans forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "What are you suggesting?" he asks, his voice full of curiosity and suspicion. Charlotte feels a wave of nausea as she realizes how far she'll have to go to salvage her plan. We can meet, talk about it in private," she suggests, trying to maintain her composure. Lucas hesitates for a moment, then slowly nods. That night, Charlotte lies in bed, feeling more lost than ever. She knows the path she's chosen is growing darker by the day, but she sees no way out. The weight of her actions and the lies she's built begin to crush her spirit. She looks at Theodore, sleeping peacefully beside her, and feels a deep ache in her heart. How could someone so full of trust and love not see the truth? The days that follow blur into a haze of secretive meetings and tense conversations with Lucas. With each passing moment, Charlotte feels the net tightening around her. Lucas, now aware of his power over her, begins to manipulate the situation, using his knowledge to force her into actions that go against everything she believed herself to be. Charlotte finds herself in a constant state of emotional agony. Every time she looks at Theodore, she feels a piercing pain, knowing she is betraying his trust in unimaginable ways. The love he shows, the tenderness in his eyes, are like daggers to her soul. She knows she is sinking deeper and deeper, and the way out seems farther away with each passing day. One day, while helping Theodore dress, he takes her hand and looks deeply into her eyes. "Charlotte, you've been my rock. I don't know how to thank you for being by my side," he says, his voice laden with emotion. Charlotte feels tears welling up in her eyes, but she forces a smile, swallowing the pain that threatens to consume her. "It's a pleasure to be here, Theodore. It always will be," she replies, her voice trembling. And as he smiles at her with unwavering confidence, Charlotte feels the weight of her actions may be too much to bear. She is trapped in a spiral of suffering, and with each passing day, the pain in her heart grows, leaving her on the brink of collapse. The silent agreement between Charlotte and Lucas unfolds in a torturous dance of manipulation and despair. Lucas takes her to secret meetings where he slowly begins to demand more from her, testing the limits of her morality and her ability to bear guilt. Each encounter is a new nightmare for Charlotte, where she feels her dignity slipping away bit by bit. On a particularly cold night, Lucas asks her to come to his apartment. The air between them is thick with almost palpable tension. Charlotte enters, her heart beating fast, fear and disgust knotting her stomach. Lucas approaches, his gaze cold and calculating, and she knows there's no escape. "Charlotte, I want more than agreements. I want you," he says, his voice soft but threatening. The world feels like it's crumbling around her. Every word from him is a blow to her already shattered soul. But she can't back down now. Not after everything she's sacrificed. She forces a smile, pushing her emotions into a dark corner of her mind. "Lucas, please, let's not complicate things," she says, trying to stay calm. But he remains unfazed, his gaze piercing through her facade. "I'm not complicating anything. I'm just making everything more interesting," he replies, moving closer. Charlotte feels tears starting to form, but she holds them back, knowing any sign of weakness will only put her in a worse position. The following days blur into a haze of secretive meetings and silent manipulations. Charlotte feels like a puppet in Lucas's hands, every strand of her life pulled by his demands. She finds herself doing things she never imagined, each action eroding her soul a little more. One afternoon, while Theodore is resting, Charlotte meets Lucas again. He seems more determined than ever, and she senses something big is about to happen. "Lucas, what do you want from me now?" she asks, her voice laden with weariness and resignation. He smiles, a cruel smile that doesn't reach his eyes. "I want you to convince my father to change the will, so that both of us can get our share," he says, as if it's the simplest thing in the world. A chill runs down Charlotte's spine. The idea of betraying Theodore further haunts her, but she sees no other choice. "I'll do what I can," she says, her voice a weak whisper. Lucas nods, satisfied, and leaves her with a cold kiss on the forehead. Back at home, Charlotte tries to find a way to broach the subject of the will with Theodore. Every conversation feels like walking a tightrope, where one misstep could lead to disaster. One evening, as they dine together, she finally gathers the courage to speak. "Theodore, I was thinking, maybe it would be a good idea to review your will, just to make sure everything is in order," she suggests, her voice trembling slightly. He looks at her, surprise and curiosity in his eyes. "Why this sudden concern, Charlotte?" he asks, gentle but perceptive. Charlotte feels her heart tighten. She knows she needs to be convincing, but guilt almost paralyzes her. "I just want to make sure you're at ease, knowing everything is as it should be," she replies, trying to sound nonchalant. Theodore smiles, a sad but grateful smile. "You're right. Let's schedule a meeting with the lawyer," he says, his voice filled with weariness. Charlotte feels a momentary relief, but she knows this is only the beginning of an even darker path. In the days that follow, Charlotte watches Theodore with painful intensity. Every smile he gives her, every word of affection, is a reminder of how much he trusts her and how much she's betraying that trust. The weight of guilt grows with each passing day, and she feels herself sinking into a sea of despair. One afternoon, while tidying up the living room, she comes across an old photo of Theodore with his children, all smiling in happier times. Tears start to silently roll down Charlotte's face. She sits on the floor, clutching the photo in her hands, allowing the pain to consume her for a moment. She knows she can't go on like this, but at the same time she sees no way out. Every path seems to lead to more suffering, and she's trapped in a web of lies and manipulations that she herself has spun. As night falls, Charlotte looks out into the darkness beyond the window, feeling more lost than ever. She knows she's teetering on the edge of a precipice, and the fall seems inevitable. But as much as it hurts, she can't give up. She promised herself she would fight to the end, and even though her heart is in pieces, she will continue, no matter the cost. The tension between Charlotte and Lucas reaches a critical point. She knows she needs to manipulate Theodore into adjusting the will, but every moment with him consumes her with guilt and pain. Theodore, growing increasingly frail, senses that something is amiss but can't quite pinpoint what it is. Charlotte feels trapped, as if she's in an emotional prison from which she cannot escape. One afternoon, Lucas confronts Charlotte again. "What's taking so long?" he asks, his voice laden with impatience. "Are you playing games with me, Charlotte?" She feels a lump in her throat but keeps her composure. "Lucas, I'm doing the best I can." "He's getting more suspicious, and I don't want him to suspect anything," she replies, her voice almost a whisper. Lucas steps closer, his presence intimidating. "You better hurry this up, or I'll spill everything to him right now," he threatens, his eyes gleaming with cold cruelty. Charlotte shudders. She knows Lucas is capable of carrying out his threats, and the pressure on her intensifies even more. Determination and desperation mingle in her heart. Charlotte decides to act that very night. While helping Theodore to bed, she tries to sound as casual as possible. "Theodore, do you think we should review the will tomorrow? Just to make sure everything is in order," she suggests, her voice trembling with anxiety. Theodore looks at her with a weary yet trusting gaze. "If it'll put your mind at ease, sure," he replies, unaware of the true intent behind her words. Charlotte feels a pang of guilt so intense it nearly makes her recoil, but she forces herself to carry on. The next day, they meet with Theodore's lawyer. As they go through the documents, Charlotte discreetly suggests some minor changes, mentioning Lucas in a favorable light. She feels the lawyer's scrutinizing gaze on her, but keeps her expression neutral. Every word she speaks is carefully chosen, but her heart is in turmoil. Finally, the lawyer proposes a few minor adjustments. Theodore agrees, unaware of the true magnitude of what is being done. Charlotte feels a momentary relief, but she knows the battle is far from over. That night, Lucas finds her in the garden. "Done?" he asks, his voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Yes," she replies, emotionally exhausted. "But this can't go on. I can't do this anymore," she confesses, her voice breaking. Lucas smiles, a smile that doesn't reach his eyes. "You don't have a choice, Charlotte. You started this and now you need to finish it," he says, his voice cold and relentless. Charlotte feels a wave of despair, but she knows he's right. She's trapped in her own web with no way out. The following weeks blur into a haze of guilt and manipulation. Charlotte tries to distance herself from Lucas, but he continues to press her. Theodore, oblivious to the betrayal around him, continues to trust her blindly. Every gesture of affection, every word of trust, is a knife to Charlotte's heart. One night, while Theodore sleeps, Charlotte sits beside him, silently watching him. Tears silently stream down her face, and she wonders how she got to this point. How could someone so full of dreams and ambitions lose themselves so completely? She stands and walks to the window, gazing out into the darkness. The weight of her choices consumes her, and she feels on the brink of collapse. But as much as it hurts, she sees no other way out. She promised herself she would fight to the end, and even though her heart is in pieces, she will continue. As the night deepens, Charlotte feels increasingly isolated. The darkness seems to engulf everything around her, and she wonders if she will ever find redemption. The silence in the house is almost deafening, and she feels like she's screaming internally, but no one can hear. She sits on the floor, hugging her knees, letting the tears flow freely. Each sob is a release of all the pain and guilt she's held onto for so long. And in that moment, she realizes she's completely alone in her battle. A battle she created herself and now seems impossible to win. The nights grow colder and lonelier for Charlotte. Guilt and despair become constant companions, and she feels her world crumbling more each day. On a particularly bleak night, Lucas shows up at her door. His eyes are hard and cold, sending a chill down Charlotte's spine. "We need to talk," he says bluntly, entering without invitation. Charlotte closes the door behind him, her heart racing. They sit in the living room, where the silence is only broken by the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Lucas, this has to end," she begins, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't take this anymore. It's destroying me." Lucas watches her with an inscrutable expression. "You knew what you were getting into, Charlotte. You can't just quit now," he replies, his voice cutting. She feels tears welling up. "I didn't know it would be like this. I'm losing myself. I can't go on living like this," she confesses, her hands trembling. Lucas leans forward, his expression hardening. "You will go on, Charlotte. Because if you don't, I'll tell my father everything. And then you'll lose everything." He threatens, each word a blow. Charlotte feels a wave of despair, but she knows he's right. She's trapped. No way out. She just nods, unable to find words. Lucas gets up, satisfied with her submission, and leaves her alone with her tortured thoughts. In the weeks that follow, Charlotte becomes a shadow of herself. She fulfills her duties to Theodore, but each day is a constant struggle to maintain the facade. Theodore, increasingly frail, trusts her more than ever, and this only deepens her guilt. One night, Theodore is particularly weak and asks Charlotte to read to him. She chooses a book of poems, her voice trembling as she reads each verse. The words, laden with emotion, seem to reflect her own pain and despair. Theodore holds her hand, squeezing it gently, and Charlotte feels tears silently streaming down her face. "Charlotte, you've been a light in my darkest days," he murmurs, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know what I would do without you." Those words tear her apart inside. She can barely continue reading, her voice faltering as she tries to choke back sobs. When she finally finishes, Theodore is asleep, his face peaceful. Charlotte rises slowly, feeling crushed under the weight of guilt. She heads to the guest room where she's been spending her nights. Lying on the bed, she cries silently, feeling more alone than ever. She knows she can't go on like this, but she sees no way out. The next day, while Theodore rests, Charlotte receives a message from Lucas. "Meet me in the living room," the message says. Her heart sinks, but she knows she can't ignore him. When she gets there, Lucas is waiting, his expression severe. "We have a problem," he says without preamble. "The lawyer suspects something's wrong. We need to act fast." Charlotte feels a wave of panic. "What are we going to do?" she asks, her voice filled with fear. Lucas smiles, a smile that offers no comfort. "You're going to convince him that everything is fine. Use your charm, do whatever it takes," he instructs, his voice cold. She feels sick, but she sees no other choice. In the days that follow, Charlotte approaches the lawyer, trying to dispel his suspicions. Each meeting is an emotional torture, but she forces a smile and uses all her cunning to maintain the facade. Finally, it seems the lawyer is convinced, but Charlotte knows it's only temporary relief. The pressure continues to mount, and she feels herself teetering on the edge of collapse. One night after a long day, Charlotte meets Lucas again. "It's sorted out for now," she says weakly. Lucas watches her, his expression unreadable. "Good. But remember, Charlotte, you can't afford to slip up. One wrong move and it's all over," he warns. Charlotte feels a silent rage building inside her, but she hides it. "I know," she replies, her voice a whisper. Lucas nods and walks away, leaving her alone once more. She returns to the guest room, where the darkness feels more oppressive than ever. Lying in bed, she feels the weight of her choices and the despair of her situation. The tears come again, and she feels lost in a sea of suffering, seeing no way out. Each day is a struggle to maintain the facade, each night a torment of guilt and regret. Charlotte knows she's on the edge of a precipice, and the fall seems inevitable. But as much as it hurts, she continues to fight, clinging to any hope of redemption. Even with her heart in pieces, she won't give up, even though the pain seems unbearable. The weeks pass slowly, each day becoming a test of emotional endurance for Charlotte. She continues to care for Theodore with unwavering dedication, but every forced smile and each word of affection she utters feel like daggers in her heart. The weight of guilt and despair consumes her, leaving her increasingly exhausted and vulnerable. One afternoon, while Theodore rests, Charlotte receives an urgent call from Lucas. "We need to meet now," he says, urgency in his voice making her heart race. She finds Lucas in the garden, his expression grave. "What happened?" she asks, trying to remain calm. "My father is deteriorating. The doctors said he may not have much time left," Lucas replies, his voice stern. Charlotte feels a chill run down her spine. The reality of the situation finally hits her hard. "Lucas, I don't know what to do," she admits, her voice breaking. He looks at her with a mix of disdain and frustration. "You know exactly what to do. You need to convince him to change the will before it's too late," he insists, his voice cold and relentless. Charlotte feels a wave of panic, but she knows Lucas is right. She needs to act quickly. That night, as she helps Theodore to bed, she tries to find the right words. Her voice trembles as she speaks, trying to sound casual. "Theodore, have you ever thought about updating your will, just to make sure everything is in order?" she asks, her voice a fragile whisper. He looks at her, his eyes tired but still full of trust. "Charlotte, I trust you. I know you'll take care of everything," he replies, his voice gentle. Charlotte feels tears starting to form, but she holds them back, forcing a smile. "I just want to make sure you're at ease," she says, her voice trembling. Theodore squeezes her hand, his touch light and reassuring. "Thank you, Charlotte. You're the best thing that has happened to me in a long time," he murmurs, his eyes slowly closing as sleep overtakes him. Charlotte stands by his side, holding his hand, feeling a deep pain in her heart. In the following days, she becomes robotic, fulfilling her tasks with precision but growing emotionally distant. Theodore, increasingly frail, notices her change but says nothing. He trusts her blindly, and that only amplifies her guilt. One night, as she sits in the living room, Charlotte receives an unexpected visit. It's Lucas, his expression tougher than ever. "Time is running out," he says bluntly. "You need to act now." Charlotte feels desperation growing inside her. "I know," she replies, her voice almost a whisper. "I know." That night, she goes to Theodore's room, determined to do what needs to be done. She sits beside him, watching him sleep. His breathing is weak and irregular, and Charlotte feels tears silently rolling down her face. "Theodore," she whispers, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." He doesn't wake up, and Charlotte allows herself to cry freely, each tear a reflection of her pain and despair. She knows she's about to betray the trust of the man who welcomed her, who loved her, but she sees no other way out. The next day, she convinces Theodore to call the lawyer once more. Sitting beside him, she forces a smile as he signs the documents, adjusting the will as needed. Each signature is a knife in her heart, but she maintains her composure, determined to finish what she started. When it's all done, Charlotte feels a wave of relief mixed with overwhelming guilt. She retreats to the guest room where she collapses in tears. The pain in her heart is unbearable, and she feels more alone than ever. In the following days, Theodore's health deteriorates rapidly. Charlotte continues to care for him with dedication, but each moment is an emotional torment. She knows her time is running out, and the guilt of her actions consumes her. One morning, Theodore calls for her, his voice weak and trembling. Charlotte rushes to his side, holding his hand. "Charlotte," he murmurs, his eyes filled with deep sadness. "Thank you for being here. You are the light in my final days." Charlotte feels tears starting to fall again. "I will always be here for you, Theodore," she replies, her voice breaking. He smiles faintly, closing his eyes. Charlotte feels the weight of her actions more than ever, knowing she's betraying the man who trusted her blindly. That night, as Theodore sleeps, Charlotte sits beside him, holding his hand. She feels the end is near, and the pain in her heart is unbearable. Tears flow freely as she whispers, "Forgive me, Theodore. I'm so sorry." And in that moment, Charlotte realizes that despite her struggle, despite her sacrifices, all that remains is pain and regret. She knows she will never find redemption, and the guilt will consume her forever. The days grow heavier and quieter. The house, once echoing with Theodore's presence, is now shrouded in palpable sadness. Charlotte feels the weight of guilt intensifying with each passing moment. She stands by Theodore as he struggles for every breath, his body frail and tired, yet his trust in her remains unwavering. On a particularly dark night, Theodore calls her with a weak voice. "Charlotte, come here," he murmurs. She quickly approaches, delicately holding his hand. "I'm here, Theodore. What do you need?" she asks, her voice a gentle whisper. He looks at her with teary eyes. "I want you to know that you mean everything to me. Thank you for being by my side until the end," he says, his voice trembling. Charlotte feels tears welling up, her pain almost unbearable. "Theodore, I thank you too. For everything," she replies, her voice breaking. They remain silent for a moment, only the sound of Theodore's weak breaths filling the room. Later that night, while Theodore sleeps, Charlotte retreats to the garden. The cold night air envelopes her body, but she barely feels the chill. Lost in her thoughts, her emotions whirl uncontrollably. Tears silently stream down her face as she kneels on the ground, feeling the cold earth beneath her knees. "I'm so sorry, Theodore," she whispers into the darkness. "I'm so sorry for everything." Suddenly, she senses a presence behind her. Lucas. He watches her in silence for a moment before approaching. "He doesn't have much time," he says, his voice cold. Charlotte stands up, wiping tears with her sleeve. "I know," she replies, her voice barely a whisper. "And I don't know how to deal with it." Lucas stares at her, his gaze impassive. "You did what needed to be done. Now all that's left is to wait," he says without a hint of compassion. A silent anger grows within Charlotte, but she suppresses it. "I should have never done this," she whispers, more to herself than to Lucas. He shrugs. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them," he replies, his voice hard and relentless. The following days blur into a haze of pain and anguish. Theodore's health deteriorates rapidly, and Charlotte finds herself increasingly powerless. She spends hours by his side, holding his hand, speaking softly, but the guilt consumes her. Every weak breath he takes is a reminder of her betrayal. One afternoon, as she helps him take a sip of water, Theodore looks at her with a tender expression. "Charlotte, you've been the best thing that happened to me," he murmurs. "I love you." Those words shatter Charlotte inside. She feels like the ground is crumbling beneath her feet. "I love you too, Theodore," she replies, her voice laden with pain. But inside she is shattered, her guilt and regret crushing her. That night Theodore doesn't wake up. Charlotte finds him motionless, his face peaceful, as if he's finally at peace. The pain and guilt mix, forming a silent scream within her. She kneels beside the bed, holding his cold hand, tears streaming endlessly. "Forgive me, Theodore. I'm so sorry," she whispers repeatedly, her voice filled with despair. But it's too late. He's gone, and she's left with the weight of her actions, overwhelming guilt and endless regret. The once silent house now becomes a tomb for her dreams and hopes. Charlotte walks through the empty corridors, feeling Theodore's presence in every corner, but knowing she will never find peace. The pain in her heart is unbearable, and she feels lost in a sea of sadness and guilt. Theodore's children arrive for the funeral, and Charlotte feels their stares, especially Lucas. He approaches her after the ceremony, his gaze hard and relentless. "You got what you wanted," he says, his voice cold. But at what cost? Charlotte doesn't respond. She knows there are no words that can express what she feels. She walks away, leaving Lucas and the others behind, walking alone through the garden where she had often been with Theodore. She sits on the bench where they last talked, feeling the emptiness around her. "Forgive me, Theodore," she whispers again, her voice lost in the night breeze. She knows she will never find redemption, that guilt and pain will accompany her forever. And as the stars shine coldly in the sky, Charlotte feels more alone than ever, trapped in an endless cycle of regret and sorrow. Theodore's house, now shrouded in silence and darkness, has become an emotional prison for Charlotte. The funeral has passed, but the pain and guilt linger, haunting every corner, every hallway. She feels Theodore's presence everywhere, yet she knows it's only the shadow of her memories and regrets. One morning, while trying to gather herself in the living room, Lucas appears again. His gaze is hard and relentless, devoid of any compassion. "We need to talk," he says, his voice cold as ice. Charlotte looks up, feeling a mix of fear and anger. "What do you want now, Lucas?" she asks, her voice weak but filled with defiance. He approaches slowly, his eyes fixed on hers. "The investigation into the will is starting. The lawyer is suspicious. We need to sort this out before he uncovers everything," he replies, his voice unwavering. Charlotte feels a wave of panic. "And what do you expect me to do? I've already done everything you asked," she says, her voice trembling. Lucas looks at her with disdain. "You will continue to play your part, Charlotte, and you will ensure that no one finds out the truth, or you know the consequences," he threatens, his voice icy. She feels anger rising within her, but she knows she's trapped. "And what will you do, Lucas? Destroy me even more?" she asks, her voice filled with pain. He merely smiles coldly. "Just do as I say," he replies before walking away, leaving Charlotte alone with her tortured thoughts. The following days blur into a haze of fear and despair. Charlotte tries to maintain her facade, but every time the lawyer appears, she feels panic gripping her. On a particularly difficult night, she finds herself again in the garden, where she had often sought solace. The darkness around her seems to reflect the emptiness within. She sits on the bench, tears silently streaming down her face. "Forgive me, Theodore. I'm so sorry," she whispers, her voice breaking. She feels the weight of the world on her shoulders, overwhelming guilt consuming her. The next morning, the lawyer arrives with a serious expression. "We need to discuss some irregularities in the will," he says, his voice firm. Charlotte feels her heart racing, panic taking over. She tries to stay calm, but she knows she's on the verge of collapse. As they discuss, Lucas appears, his threatening presence filling the room. "What's the issue here?" he asks, his voice authoritative. The lawyer stares at him undeterred. "There are some questions about the changes in the will. We need clarification," he replies. Lucas shoots a warning glance at Charlotte. "There's nothing to clarify. Everything was done as my father wished," he says firmly. The lawyer doesn't seem convinced, but Charlotte feels Lucas's threat is enough to keep him quiet, at least for now. When the lawyer finally leaves, Charlotte feels herself crumbling. She retreats to her room where she collapses in tears. The pain, guilt, and despair are overwhelming, and she feels like she can't go on. But she knows she has no choice. On a gloomy afternoon, as she stares out the window, she sees Lucas approaching again. His expression is hard and relentless. "We have to sort this out once and for all," he says, his voice cold. Charlotte turns to him, feeling on the brink of collapse. "What do you want me to do now, Lucas?" she asks, her voice filled with desperation. He steps closer, his eyes locked on hers. "We're going to destroy any documents that could incriminate you, and we'll make sure the lawyer doesn't continue his investigation," he replies, his voice unwavering. She feels growing anger and despair. "You're asking me to do more than I've already done," This will destroy me completely, she says, her voice trembling. Lucas stares at her, relentless. You have no choice, Charlotte. Do as I say or everything will come crashing down, he threatens. Charlotte feels the weight of her choices crushing her. She knows she's trapped with no way out. And as she prepares to do what Lucas orders, she feels like she's losing herself more and more. That night, as she destroys the documents, tears roll down her cheeks incessantly. Forgive me, Theodore. I'm so sorry, she whispers into the darkness, her voice filled with pain and regret. And as the house remains silent, Charlotte knows she will never find redemption. Time passes slowly, each day becoming an emotional torment for Charlotte. She destroyed the incriminating documents, yet guilt and despair continued to consume her. Lucas, always present, ensures she doesn't forget the dire situation she's in. One morning, while trying to piece her life together, Charlotte receives a letter. Her hands tremble as she opens it and reads the words revealing an official investigation into Theodore's will alteration. Panic overwhelms her, feeling on the verge of collapse. Lucas enters the room and sees horror etched on Charlotte's face. What happened now? He asks, his voice stern. Lucas, they're investigating. I received a letter. They know something's wrong, she replies, her voice broken with fear. He takes the letter from her hands and reads quickly. This can't be happening, he mutters, frustration and anger evident. We need to resolve this once and for all. Charlotte feels despair mounting. Lucas, I don't know what else to do. We're finished, she whispers, tears beginning to fall. Lucas holds her shoulders firmly, his expression unyielding. We're not going down. You're going to help me fix this, whatever it takes, he commands, his voice icy. The days that follow are a spiral of fear and anguish. Charlotte finds herself forced to take extreme measures to protect herself and Lucas. Each decision she makes is a step deeper into an abyss she knows she can never escape. One night, alone in the living room, Charlotte hears a noise at the door. She turns quickly, her heart pounding. Theodore's lawyer stands there, his expression serious. Charlotte, we need to talk, he says firmly. Panic overtakes her again, but she tries to remain calm. What's wrong? She asks, her voice trembling. There are many inconsistencies in Theodore's will. We need to understand what really happened, he replies, approaching. Tears start to well up in Charlotte's eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, she lies, her voice barely a whisper. The lawyer stares at her, his gaze penetrating. Charlotte, I know you're involved. Don't make this harder than it already is, he says, his voice serious. Desperation rises within her, but before she can respond, Lucas appears. She doesn't know anything. Stop accusing her without evidence, he says firmly and authoritatively. The lawyer faces Lucas undeterred. I'm just doing my job, Lucas. I will uncover the truth whether you like it or not, he replies before leaving Charlotte and Lucas in oppressive silence. Lucas turns to Charlotte, his expression hardening. We need to do something now or we're done for, he says urgently, his voice filled with urgency. Charlotte feels suffocated by despair. What else do you want me to do? I've destroyed all the documents, I've lied and manipulated. I can't do this anymore, she whispers, her voice breaking. Lucas grips her tightly, his eyes cold. You will continue. We have no choice, he orders, his voice relentless. A wave of resignation and sadness washes over Charlotte. She knows she's trapped with no way out. Each passing day, she sinks deeper into a sea of guilt and regret. That night, alone in the guest room, Charlotte sits on the bed, tears streaming down her face. She takes out a photo of Theodore she had kept and gazes at it, feeling the crushing pain in her heart. Forgive me, Theodore. I'm so sorry, she whispers, her voice filled with despair. As the tears continue to fall, Charlotte realizes she can't go on like this. She is broken inside, every piece of her soul shattered by the choices she made. And now she knows she must find a way to redeem herself, even if it means sacrificing everything. The following days are a whirlwind of fear and despair. Charlotte tries to find a way out, but every path seems to lead to more pain and suffering. She knows Lucas will never leave her alone, but she also knows she can't go on living with this guilt. In a night of desperation, Charlotte makes a decision. She chooses to confess everything, to tell the truth to the lawyer and face the consequences of her actions. She knows it could destroy her life, but she also knows it's the only way to find some relief from her overwhelming guilt. The next morning, she goes to the lawyer's office, her hands trembling. "I need to talk to you," she says, her voice weak but resolute. The lawyer looks at her with curiosity and suspicion, but gestures for her to come in. As Charlotte begins to tell her story, tears roll down her cheeks, but she continues. Every word is a weight off her heart, but also a step closer to the edge. She knows she's taking a risk, but it's the only path she sees to find some peace. When she finishes, the lawyer stares at her in silence for a moment before speaking. "This will have consequences, Charlotte. Do you understand what you've done?" he asks, his voice grave. She nods, tears still falling. "I do, and I accept it. I just can't live with this guilt anymore," she replies, her voice full of despair. And as the lawyer prepares to take the necessary steps, Charlotte feels a sense of relief mixed with deep fear. She knows her life will never be the same, but she also knows she's finally facing the truth, no matter how painful it is. Charlotte sits in the lawyer's office, her hands still trembling after her confession. The weight of her words hangs heavy in the air, making the atmosphere oppressive and tense. She looks at the lawyer, who is silent, absorbing everything he's heard. Finally, he sighs deeply and breaks the silence. "Charlotte, what you've done is extremely serious, but your courage to confess may be the only thing that can still save you," he says, his voice firm yet tinged with compassion. Charlotte nods slowly, knowing his words are true. She feels vulnerable and exposed, as if every part of her soul has been laid bare. "I'm ready to accept the consequences," she whispers, her voice weak but determined. The lawyer gazes at her for a moment, then stands up. "Let's deal with this. We need to set things right. But you should be aware that this won't be easy," he says, guiding her out of his office. Charlotte leaves, feeling exhausted but strangely relieved. When she returns home, Lucas is waiting for her. He can see the change in her demeanor, the air of determination mixed with emotional exhaustion. "Where have you been?" he asks, his voice laden with suspicion. Charlotte meets his gaze, feeling a new wave of courage rising within her. "I confessed everything to the lawyer. The lie is over, Lucas," she says, her voice firm despite the fear she feels. Lucas looks at her with disbelief and anger. "You did what?" he shouts, his face contorting in fury. He advances towards her, gripping her arms tightly. "You're going to ruin everything." She pulls away, her body trembling. "I couldn't go on like this anymore. The guilt was killing me," she replies, tears starting to fall. "Theodore didn't deserve this, and I don't deserve to live with this pain." Lucas releases her, his expression momentarily softening as he observes the genuine pain on her face. But anger soon returns. "You've destroyed us both. Are you aware of that?" he says, his voice cold. Charlotte takes a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I know, but it was the only way out," she replies, her voice still shaky. Lucas stares at her for a few more seconds before angrily leaving the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The following days blur into a haze of interrogations and confrontations. The lawyer works to rectify the discrepancies in the will, and Charlotte finds herself repeatedly explaining her actions to authorities. Each time she tells her story, she feels a mix of relief and despair, knowing she's getting closer to fully facing the consequences of her choices. Finally, the day of the trial arrives. Charlotte enters the courtroom, feeling the weight of everyone's stares upon her. She sees Lucas on the other side of the room, his gaze filled with fury and disdain. The judge watches her with a stern expression, ready to hear her testimony. As Charlotte begins to speak, tears well up, but she forces herself to continue. She tells everything from the moment she discovered Theodore's illness to Lucas's manipulations and her own overwhelming guilt. Every word is a stab to her heart, but she knows she needs to be honest. "I'm sorry for everything. For the pain I've caused, for the trust I've betrayed," she says, her voice breaking at the end. "I know that nothing I say or do can undo what happened, but I'm here to accept my responsibilities." The judge watches her in silence for a moment before speaking. "Charlotte, your actions were serious and caused a lot of suffering. However, your confession and willingness to face the consequences show genuine remorse. Justice must be served, but we also recognize your willingness to make amends." Charlotte feels a mixture of relief and fear as the judge pronounces the sentence. She will be punished for her crimes, but there's a sense that she may eventually find a path to redemption. Lucas, on the other hand, faces his own consequences, his anger turned into despair. In the months that follow, Charlotte works to rebuild her life. Each day is a battle against guilt and sadness, but she clings to the hope that she can find a new direction. She engages in volunteer work, helping others overcome their own pains and regrets, seeking a way to atone for her own sins. One night, while alone in her small apartment, Charlotte picks up Theodore's photo again. She gazes at it, tears beginning to fall. "I'm so sorry, Theodore. I hope one day you can forgive me," she whispers, her voice filled with pain and longing. She places the photo on a shelf and sits down, looking out into the dark night beyond the window. The journey to redemption is long and painful, but Charlotte knows she's on the right path. And as the stars shine in the sky, she feels a small spark of hope growing inside her, a fragile yet persistent light that guides her through the darkness.